In January 2019, 3 members of a far-right militia were sentenced to a combined 81 years in prison in Kansas. This was because they were planning an attack to murder Muslims en masse on American soil, convinced that they had a duty to prevent the government from selling the country to Muslims. This group called themselves the Crusaders. When talking about the history of Christianity, the Crusades are one of the most recurring topics. For those who don't know, the Crusades were a series of military campaigns carried out by the powers of Christian Western Europe against the Muslims, who at that time occupied the Levant region, or the Holy Land as it was called. This series of wars lasted between approximately 1095 and 1291, and involved a long series of events such as battles, the establishment of Crusader states, and of course, massacres. However, it is no secret that these were a total failure. A large number of European soldiers' lives were lost in vain, with the Crusades being nothing more than a great fiasco far from the romanticized version of many traditionalist Christians, particularly Catholics and Orthodox. This misconception of the brave Templar soldier fighting heroically for God against the Muslim enemy is quite wrong, and there is enough evidence to doubt the discourse that glorifies the Crusades as a great historical milestone and heroic campaigns, being instead violent wars in which no one with common sense would like to participate. Before beginning, I want to clarify that in this video I will refer specifically to the Crusades carried out in the Levant. Other events called Crusades, like the Reconquista or the wars against the Cathars, will not be taken into account for this video. With that said, let's start with the video. All sources in the description. Before breaking down the crimes and atrocities that occurred during them, we must put ourselves in context and understand how and why the Crusades originated. By the 1000s AD, Seljuk Turks were expanding throughout the Levant and Mediterranean region, bringing their own religion with them, Islam. These areas were previously territories of the weakened Byzantine Empire, with whom the Muslims had different wars for years, inflicting heavy defeats such as in Manzikert. This unstabilized Byzantium, which could only be stabilized when Alexios Komnenos took power. In order to restore Byzantine power, the help of some external country was needed, turning to the Christians of the West. During the conquest of the Levant by the Muslims, the Christian populations were gradually replaced by Muslims. Spain, North Africa, southern Italy and Anatolia were severely affected areas. What's more, there was a lot of piracy and looting by different European populations in the aforementioned areas. Although it is true that in a certain way, the Christians who remained in conquered lands were respected as long as they submitted to certain laws, and even coexisted with Muslims, in general terms the Muslims presented themselves as conquerors. Given the actions, Pope Urban at the Council of Clermont declared holy war, calling on the different Christians of Europe to unite to recover the Holy Land, beginning the Crusades. In that sense, I could agree with the premise that the Crusades were a response of Christian Europe to Islamic aggression. However, here come my objections to the pro-Crusade narrative, and that is that while I consider that politically and strategically the Crusades were justified, the practice is not how the TradCaths paint it, but something totally different and darker. In total, it is estimated that there were 9 Crusades, with their size and objectives varying. However, it is no secret to anyone that of those 9 Crusades, only one, the first, was successful. The other expeditions launched by the European kingdoms were nothing more than pathetic and simple failures in their results. To judge this, let's look at the general objectives of the Crusades, these being: defeat the Muslim threat and recover Byzantine territory. Try to reunite the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Strengthen the power of the papacy as supreme leader of the church. Recover Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Defend Christianity was also a goal for many crusaders. These were the objectives set by the Crusader leaders. However, at the end of the conflicts, the Muslims continued to be a threat, eventually advancing into the Balkans, and Byzantium was weakened. The difference between Catholicism and Orthodoxy only grew stronger. The papacy lost prestige due to failures. Jerusalem and the Holy Land remained under Islamic control. Many crusaders died in vain and several feudal leaders lost power. With this in mind, it is very easy to conclude that the Crusades were a total disaster for the Christian world. Furthermore, for the greater humiliation of the European world, many of the Crusaders were surprised by the advance that the Muslims had, which favored trade and the desire for their products. Of all the Crusades, only the first was successful. The rest of them were nothing more than Muslims kicking Catholic butts. Some examples of what I'm saying are: Battle of Hattin, in which the Crusader forces were completely crushed by the Muslims to the point that they were unable to stop Saladin's advances, and Jerusalem fell shortly after. This humiliation reached the point that several of its leaders, including Templars, were taken prisoner. Even the True Cross, one of the most sacred Crusaders' relic, was captured. Battle of Nicopolis, where the Crusaders underestimated the military capabilities of their enemies, leading them to suffer another crushing defeat before them, ending the idea of the Great and Holy Crusades and the consolidation of Ottoman power in the Balkans. Battle of Mansura, which was the last chance for success in the Seventh Crusade. In this, the Christian forces were not only defeated, but they showed such disorder that many of them were massacred. Shortly after, they were also defeated at Farisker, losing most of their army. I can easily cite more Crusader disasters, but I think you get the point. However, I have yet to talk about their failure and why it happened. There are a large number of factors that led to the eventual defeat of the Crusaders. Like the incredible difficulty of keeping the troops supplied. With the distance of the troops from the front, the Crusaders tended to have very little supplies, making them thirsty and hungry. Or how incredibly costly these campaigns were, to the point that leaders had to be attentive to the military front in the Levant as well as the internal front, and in fact several had to withdraw from the actions because it was costing their countries. Or the techniques and strategies of the Muslims that ended up overwhelming the Crusaders. In fact, one of the causes of the victory of the First Crusade was precisely that the Crusaders had better weapons, something that the Muslims resolved, eventually making the Crusaders the ones who had to level out. I can easily go on and on about the many mistakes made by the Crusaders in their campaigns, but at this level it is already very obvious. Now I want to move on to something else. One of the things that the TradCaths promote a lot about the Crusades is the unity that was achieved in the Christian world. But an investigation is enough to see that that is also a lie. Within the Crusader leadership there had been a great level of infighting. The leaders of each of the countries involved looked out for their own interests, which led them to not show an united front. This can be evidenced by the different agendas of each leader who wanted to handle the conflict their way. This rivalry was used by the Muslims to defeat the Christians on several occasions. And these cases of dispute are not limited to just the leaders, there were also many cases of divisions and conflicts within the Christian ranks. Competition and indiscipline abounded among the Crusader ranks, and they did not know who exactly they were fighting, knowing very little about Islam. What's more, during these campaigns different Muslim localities allied themselves with the Crusaders, in the same way that there were alliances between Christian leaders and Muslims for their own benefit. To this disunity within the forces we must add the still latent division between Catholics and Orthodox, which only strengthened at the end of these. Many defenders of the Crusaders have the idea that these knights lived noble and glorious lives, painting them as heroic warriors who fought with courage and daring. However, the reality is that most of the Crusaders had a very difficult and harrowing time during these conflicts. To begin with, we can mention the long and arduous journey. Thousands of kilometers from Europe to the Middle East, not to mention the Mediterranean and the numerous obstacles until they reached their destination, therefore there were a lot of desertions and retreats along the way. Not to mention that many were on the verge of death from starvation, or the incredible difficulty they had in acquiring water. During the Crusades, shortages of basic resources were common among Christian troops. In addition to the great indiscipline of the Crusaders, when it came to filling their stomachs, on more than one occasion they had to resort to literal cannibalism, both of their enemies and of their own forces, and this was not a passive event. Numerous witnesses claim that the Crusaders committed cannibalism in an aggressive manner. If they were lucky, they could also add a few plant roots to their diet, but if not, they knew they had no choice. And that's just on the food side. On the hydration side things don't get any better. Because of the travel and the intense summer in the Holy Land, the Crusaders suffered horrendously from the heat, and the hot summer of those lands, or the scorched area product of its time for a long period. This caused a murderous thirst that brought many to the brink of death. For example, in the summer of 1097, approximately 500 Crusaders died from lack of water. This ignoring the fact that they still had to battle, where at best they were wounded. Speaking of wounds, it is worth mentioning medicine. Going to a battle was as dangerous as going to a hospital. We are talking about the Middle Ages where medicine was rather crude. A simple wound could get an arm or leg amputated, making the chance of death even higher due to bleeding. However, wounds were less of a concern. There were several diseases in the Crusader troops, such as scurvy, which killed 1/6 of the Frankish army in the Fifth Crusade. Another example comes from the terrible hygiene caused by the Crusaders, who were making themselves sick with diseases and parasites such as dysentery. To this we have to add other factors, such as the horrendous punishments of the time for badly behaved Crusaders, or unexpected disasters such as earthquakes, or Crusaders killing other Christians. I could easily go on explaining how Crusaders suffered horrendous lives during campaigns, but I think it's clear by now. At this point any guy who wants to be a Crusader is a total moron. It is estimated that at least 1 in 20 Crusaders made it to the Holy Land, and that's if we don't think he died later as a result of the aforementioned factors. The most generous rates of losses in the First Crusade claim at least 1/3 dead, while others claim that more than half of the Crusaders, between 60% and 90%, died. That in the First Crusade, which was the successful one, now imagine in the others, which were a total disaster. Oh, and just in case you thought that the Crusades could not be worse. Wars, by their nature, are violent, that is no secret to anyone. However, within the most conservative circles of Catholicism and Orthodoxy, there is a clear idea that the Crusades were honorable wars, and that all the Crusaders were knights riding white horses. However, this is far from reality. There are multiple evidences and cases that show Christian soldiers more as violent bandits and criminals than as honorable soldiers. This also applies to members of the various military orders, including the much romanticized and overrated Templars. In fact, several armies had to rely on bandits in order to face their enemies. Moving on in the wave of crimes committed by the Crusaders, we can find the People's Crusade, which was a massive campaign of murder against Jews in Europe. Or the various sackings of Jerusalem every time this city was occupied, with a large number of people dying during these actions. And in fact, not only Jerusalem, but a lot of cities in the region, even in the way of the Crusaders, were victims of all kinds of outrages, killing dozens and even hundreds of people. If anything stands out the Crusades, it is the great wave of crimes that were committed in its realization, so many that it would take quite a long time to talk about each of them. Events such as the aforementioned sacking of Jerusalem, the People's Crusade, the sackings of Antioch and Constantinople, which the Crusaders wanted to defend so much, the cannibalism, the various sieges that only ended in Crusader disasters. In short, I think it is already very clear the inherent violence of the Crusades. But perhaps, for those who still defend the Crusades, the idea of being a hero still sounds attractive. We are talking about figures like Saladin or Richard Lionheart, or even the Templars. Well, Richard Lionheart, in the Third Crusade, faced deadly storms and possibly the deadliest Saladin. He died at war with his former fellow Crusader, King Philip II. While overseeing a siege, Richard was shot in the arm with a crossbow bolt and died of a wound infection. Saladin, the revered Sultan, brilliant architect of the Battle of Hattin and conqueror of Jerusalem, died of typhoid fever, and I think we all know what happened to the Templars. And I know that the crimes were not only committed by Christians, but also Muslims committed massacres. For example, the Ismaili minorities being persecuted by the Sunnis. Or the aforementioned attacks on neutral ships in the Mediterranean. But I will not dwell too much on this since I never knew a Muslim romanticizing the Crusades. To conclude the video, what conclusions can we draw? Simple. The Crusades, although defensive to a certain extent, were horrendous conflicts that should not be repeated. One of the greatest failures of the Catholic Church and an example of how dangerous religious fanaticism or blind obedience to an authority can be just because it is God's will, or Deus vult, as the morons who defend the Crusades say. I assure you that of all those idiots who defend them as a heroic act in defense of the Western world, at least 75% of them would die before reaching Jerusalem. At this point, anyone who defends the Crusades is either ignorant of history or hates Islam. In fact, during the Crusades, Islamophobic rhetoric was promoted by the Catholic Church, but while that can be understood in a context of war, today, the Crusades are taken as a banner by the religious far right, in a rallying cry against Muslims. And I am saying this as a Christian myself. But because of that, and because I really want to be consistent with the pacifist discourse that Christianity professes, at least in theory, I cannot stand by while some morons romanticize these nonsensical wars, in which many lives were lost in a conflict that, in the end, achieved nothing. But I know that regardless of what we say, they will continue to shout that Deus Vult slogan. So, because of the above, I want to end this video with the following. For the defenders of the Crusades, they were not based because they were Christians defending their faith, they were based because they were Christians killing Muslims.